greatest African midfielder.
He's the most naturally talented player that I played with.
See if your choice made the list on Match of the Day Africa Top 10 from the BBC World Service. Find it wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Welcome to The Inquiry with me, Tanya Beckett. One question, 4 expert witnesses, and an answer. On June the 7th, 2023, New Yorkers woke up to a sky that was coloured an eerie orange.
Let's turn to extraordinary pictures now from North America, where tens of millions of people have been warned about potentially dangerous air quality as intense wildfires burn across Canada. A haze hangs over much
Schools across the United States East Coast cancelled outdoor activities. Airline traffic slowed, and millions of Americans were urged to stay indoors and wear masks to protect themselves from potentially toxic fine particles in the air. The source of the pollution was many hundreds of kilometres north in Canada. America's neighbour was in the grip of the worst wildfires in recorded history. From coast to coast, hundreds of blazes were devouring millions of acres of forest, forcing more than 100,000 people from their homes and blanketing cities across North America in clouds of toxic smoke. And the problem is expected to get worse on a global scale. The number of wildfires across the world is increasing, and by the end of the century they're predicted to double in number. This week on The Inquiry, we're asking, how can we stop wildfires?
Part 1. Canada is burning.
In all my years living here, I've never in my life seen so many fires. It's almost like living in hell.
Canada is a very forested country. As everybody knows, we're a very large country and we have a lot of forests. It's 9 or 10% of the total forest country in the world.
Canada's forests cover about a third of the nation, and there are many wildfires every year. But this year's conflagrations are particularly widespread, numerous, and intense. Our first expert witness is Mike Norton, Director General of the Canadian Forest Service.
In early May, the weather was hot and dry, the forests were extremely dry, and we had numerous fires start that grew quite aggressively through the first part of May. Those fires then, expanded into other neighboring jurisdictions in Western and Northern Canada. And then later into May, we had fires start in the eastern part of the country, and then a dramatic spike again following some lightning activity in the province of Quebec that continued to burn very aggressively right now. And now with hot and dry weather in Ontario in the central part of the country, again, we're seeing some additional fires starting there. So from a very sudden, quick start, it has been a steady trajectory upward.
The fires have burned an area equivalent to the countries of Switzerland and Israel combined. In many cases, Canadian authorities are struggling to bring the blazes under control. The sheer size of the problem means that firefighters are heavily reliant on modern technology to locate them.
So there are numerous satellites circling the globe on a regular basis that derive data that are very useful for finding out where fires are burning, the level of activity to help direct firefighting efforts on the ground. There are newer technologies that are being deployed now as well in drones that can be flown over or near fire areas again to get remotely sensed data on the location and behavior of fires that can influence our understanding of which way the fire would be burning and what might be most at risk.
This capability for precise aerial mapping is particularly vital in safeguarding Canadian citizens in far-flung parts of the country.
Some of the communities that are being most directly impacted are relatively smaller communities. Some of them are very remote. Some populations that need to be evacuated, the only way out is by airplane or boat, as many northern communities have no road access. And so those folks need to be accommodated while they are under evacuation. And the turnout by host communities to welcome evacuees in and to ensure they're supported is it's a wonderful thing to see. And all of that helps people get through what is otherwise a very stressful time.
Vast and numerous wildfires are, of course, nothing new in Canada. From April to September, thousands occur every year, and about half of them are started by lightning. But Mike says they seem to be getting worse.
We are seeing more aggressive fire behavior, and we are seeing a lengthening of our fire seasons starting earlier in the spring and later into the fall. So on average, although the forests have an ecological relationship with fire, the numbers that we're seeing and the patterns that we're seeing are increasingly deviating from historical norms or historical averages.
This year, Canada has been particularly badly hit. But the worrying trend towards more devastating wildfires is by no means unique to North America. Time for our next expert witness.
Part 2. Secrets of the Forest.
I'm Liz Goldman, and I'm with the World Resources Institute.
Our second expert witness says that her organisation, like many others, is noticing a worrying rise in forest fires, not just in North America, but across the globe.
They're happening with increasing intensity. Their ranges are spreading. They're happening in tropical, humid, moist forests where we wouldn't really expect them to. And then they're certainly happening in temperate and boreal forests as well, where they're more of a natural part of the ecosystem, but they're happening more frequently in a way that is impacting the overall health of the forest in a negative way and the people who live around those forests.
Perhaps the most concerning place that wildfires are becoming an increasing problem is in the tropics. Here, the humidity is very high, and even in the dry season, the plants are usually too wet to be ignited by lightning or accidentally lit by locals. Instead, the vast majority of the fires in the rainforests of the Amazon and Indonesia are man-made and intentional. The result of deforestation and clearing of farmland by what is termed slash and burn.
So people will clear land using fire, and what happens is that when the fires are set, the intention is for a landowner to clear vegetation, trees off of their property, but it's often difficult to only have it stop at a property line. So it will often spread out beyond a given property unintentionally and move through the forest.
Farmers also often dry out the naturally wet soil so that it can be used for planting. This means that when fires are started in the forest, they can spread more easily than they otherwise would, and are more likely to get out of control. In 2015, blazes started in this way in Indonesia led to the worst wildfire season in a century.
It was, land being cleared for mostly palm oil plantations. When that happens, the peat areas need to be drained. They're dried out, they become flammable, and they catch fire quite easily. So when land is cleared by fire, it can spread onto these peat areas that are flammable, and it's just very difficult to put out the fires when that happens.
As a result, Indonesia experienced one of the biggest environmental disasters of the modern era.
Smoke from Indonesia's burning peatland blankets the forests of Sumatra and Borneo Islands and coats the lungs of the people who live there. With pollution,
the smoke led to the loss of life of 100,000 Indonesians, and downwind neighbours Singapore and Malaysia also lost thousands of their own citizens as a result of the pollution.
It's very bad for human health, for people living close to the area, but smoke from these fires can travel hundreds of miles, of course, and impact communities far-flung from where the actual emissions are happening. And because when wildfires burn, they actually burn the biomass that's stored in the vegetation that's being burned. So in tropical forests, many of these areas are older growth trees that have massive amounts of carbon stored within them, and that gets released into the atmosphere when they're burned. And that exacerbates climate change, which has a whole host of other impacts for people all across the world.
Climate change is not only exacerbated by wildfires, but is also often cited as a reason for them getting worse, because it leads to more prolonged periods of dry weather. But there are also long-established weather systems that can contribute to the problem. In the case of Indonesia, a weather system called El Niño was cited as another main reason for the wildfires spreading. El Niño is a warming of waters in the Pacific. In 2015, this stopped the rains from reaching Indonesia, making the ground drier and more exposed to risk of fire. Similarly, in 2021, Russia suffered record-breaking heat and drought, mainly attributed to a northward shift of the polar jet stream. For the first time in recorded history, wildfire smoke from boreal or deciduous and coniferous forests in Siberia reached as far as the North Pole.
So in 2021, Russia had a record-breaking fire year, and a lot of the fire activity was happening in Siberia, some of which was happening, again, in peat soils or melted permafrost areas where there's massive amounts of carbon stored in the soil that's released into the atmosphere there.
Further west, 2022 was a particularly bad year for wildfires in Europe. According to the European Forest Fire Information System, Spain was the continent's worst-hit country. More than 300,000 hectares were destroyed in nearly 500 blazes. The figures are indeed alarming when looked at in isolation. But it's also the case that wildfires are a natural and necessary part of the ecosystem. So when does normal tip over into dangerous and unhealthy?
Whether you call it football or soccer in your part of the world, Match of the Day Africa Top 10 is the podcast bringing you the best of African football. I'm former Congolese captain Gabriel Zakwani, and joining me for hosting duties, Ivory Coast's Yaya Toure.
Hi, Yaya Toure here.
And Nigeria's Efen Okoku.
Hi.
Each week we're trying to decide who makes it to number one on our African football top 10 lists. That's Match of the Day Africa Top 10 from the BBC World Service. Find it wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Part 3. Fire in Nature.
The history of wildfires goes back to the history of plants moving from the water onto land, which happened 400 million years ago. We have good charcoal evidence from the fossil record showing that we've had wildfires on our landscape throughout the world for hundreds of millions of years. So this is nothing new.
Our third expert witness is John Keeley, a senior research scientist with the US Geological Survey and an adjunct professor at the University of California in Los Angeles.
We have in California, in our shrublands, which occur at the lower elevations near the coast, we have hundreds of species that simply will not reproduce unless there's a fire. They'll produce seeds, and those seeds go in the soil, and then the seeds have a requirement for smoke to stimulate their germination. And they may sit in the soil for 100 years, and there's very low diversity because they're dormant. But once a fire comes through, they germinate, and diversity goes way up on our burned landscapes. And we see similar phenomenon in other Mediterranean climate ecosystems like South Africa and Western Australia. Many of these have these fire-dependent species that simply will not complete their life cycle without a fire.
Wildfires are then, at least to some extent, necessary. But as we heard from Liz Goldman in part 2, the evidence strongly suggests they are becoming more extreme.
So what's changed?
Well, a lot of things have changed. In particular, the number of people on Earth has increased. What has also changed is the way people view fire. For example, many indigenous people used fire regularly in managing their landscapes. But when those landscapes were taken over by other people, take, for example, North America, many of our land management agencies have felt it necessary to put out all fires. And this has had negative impacts on some ecosystems. And so those are probably the big issues, is the growth of the human population puts more people in contact, and then people have altered our fire regimes, which has had various impacts on our ecosystems.
A growing population means more demand on land. Timber companies, for example, want to protect their trees by stopping fires occurring. But John says this has been part of the problem.
And so historically, many of our forests had frequent fires, maybe every 10 to 20 years, and they were of low intensity because they burned on the forest floor and didn't get into the canopy of the trees. Today, though, we have such heavy fuel accumulation.
What John is saying here is that vegetation that has not been allowed to burn naturally builds up, meaning that wildfires that follow are more intense.
And now we're seeing a change in the regime from low intensity to very high intensity fires that take out the entire forest. And this is all the result of the management practices that occurred in the past with the goal of trying to put out all fires. As a result, we've put out fires for a long time, but now we are faced with conditions that result in even more extreme fires.
The growing global population also has another effect. For example, urban sprawl brings with it more infrastructure to transport electricity.
And in the last 20 years, we've had like a 5-fold increase in area burned due to power lines. And this is particularly a problem in areas where we have extremely high winds. And those winds have knocked down power lines repeatedly. And so today we're seeing our major determinant of big fires in California are power line failures that occur during these extreme wind events.
Population growth means that there are more people to start accidental fires. But we also know it's led to an increase in carbon footprint.
I think there's no question that climate change is impacting wildfires. It makes them worse. I think it would be a stretch to say that the increase in the size and frequency of our large fires is entirely due to climate change.
With a larger wildfire problem comes the need for more sophisticated tactics to get them under control. Time for our final expert witness.
Part 4. Fighting fire with fire.
Fire needs 3 things. It needs oxygen, fuel and heat. Fire is sustained by having all 3 of those elements live and available at all times.
The first aspect of firefighting is what our final expert witness describes as the fire triangle: oxygen, fuel and heat.
My name is Matt Oakley and I'm a fire investigation and wildfire officer for Surrey Fire and Rescue in the south of England.
Matt is one of the UK's wildfire tactical advisors and part of a team of international firefighters. He explains that fighting fire in forests and natural landscapes is very different from tackling them in towns and cities.
A building fire behaves in a certain way, it's confined by the walls, you've got control over its direction. Water's quite an effective media there, but when you've got open habitats around the world where you've got an expanse of fuel that just continues for mile after mile after mile, you think of the volume of water you would need to control that kind of fire. It doesn't exist in the areas we're asking it to exist.
When water to extinguish the fire is in short supply, then the next approach is to deprive the flames of anything to burn.
If you manage the fuel, you manage the risk. If you remove the fuel, you remove the risk. And how you do that is down to a varying process. So applying water, removing the fuel, and ultimately what you're doing is removing one part of that triangle of fire. For it to be sustained, it needs fuel, oxygen and heat. And if you take one of those parts away, in however you do it, then you get control of a fire environment.
Matt recalls using this method to fight an enormous wildfire in South Africa. He was visiting friends and found himself using his training to battle flames in a landscape that was unfamiliar to him. He says it was a chance to take on board new techniques.
We were removing with chainsaws huge trees. I mean, a good 10, 20 years worth of growth. Hand tools could be adopted where people could go in with rakes and hoes and dragging all that vegetation out to create a bare earth environment, so that when the fire got to this point, which took about 2 hours to get to, there was nothing left to burn. So in effect, by removing the fuel, we'd stopped the fire spread. Had we not put that fire break in, that fire would have continued onwards for hours.
And there is yet another factor which Matt says he considers very carefully when he's tasked with fighting a fire. If the heat of the fire is for any reason brought closer to the ground, then it dries it and warms it, preparing it for more rapid burning.
When you introduce wind, it gives a fire direction and it pushes the flames closer to the earth. So the flames are pushed from vertical to an angle that's closer to the fuel in front of it. And what that does, the radiant heat, it preheats the fuel ahead of the fire. It means that the fire is self-igniting ahead of itself, which accelerates its burning. When it meets a slope, it does exactly the same thing. So instead of the wind driving the flame towards the earth is rising to meet the flame. For every 10-degree increase in slope, a fire would double in speed.
I asked Matt what it was like fighting fires in these circumstances.
They are absolutely terrifying. When you're in those conditions where the weather is at absolute perfect temperature, the wind is driving the fire greater than you want it to be, the slope is all working, all of those factors, if they're all in play, it can be like Dante's Inferno. It is a terrifying place to be. I've had some of the most terrifying moments on wildfires where they will move at a speed where you can't outrun them. So the vegetation is burning faster than a human being could run. America's there's got countless incidents of firefighters that have dropped into wildfire environments and they've lost all of them.
The risk presented by these conditions are undeniably huge, as are the consequences of excessive inhalation of smoke. Wildfires around the world are getting more prevalent, more intense and more damaging. Climate change leads to drier seasons and increases the amount of fuel available for fires to burn and therefore help them spread. But they're also linked to growing populations because there are more people to start them and more reasons to stop them. Wildfires are a normal, even healthy part of the ecosystem. And when we try to stop them altogether, then we allow fuel to gather on the floor of the forest. The answer, of course, is better management and more incentives for companies to clear the forest floor. Added to that, placing increased value on the skills of the people tasked with fighting them.